I've decided to start with a book that will need very little in the way of introduction. It's 50 Shades of Grey by E.L. James. Despite the fact that this book weighs in at nearly 520 pages, the story is not a complicated one. Basically, Anastasia Steele is a student. She's coming to the end of her course, and through the university magazine she meets a man called Christian Grey, who just happens to be a billionaire, and they form a relationship. Christian would prefer a relationship based around bondage and sadomasochism. She's not quite so keen. She does a fair amount of soul searching, and that is the book. There was an element of this book being marketed as a self-published book, a piece of fan fiction that was picked up by a major publishing house and became this overnight sensation. But the main reason I think that most people will have picked up this book is due to the explicit nature of its sexual content. But that in itself is a curious thing. The book avoids certain words such as penis and vagina. These are words in common usage, everyday usage, and by simply not using them at all, E.L. James is sometimes left scrambling around for an alternative, which occasionally becomes a little contrived. Now, whether she's avoided these words because they compromise the romantic tone she's trying to achieve, or because there's some sort of censorship involved, it's possible that if you use these words, you have to be on the top shelf of the bookshop and not marketed to a mainstream audience. But I can't really see that that's the case, so it feels a little bit unnatural. The second thing is that the description of the sexual acts is highly repetitive, so much so that it begins to lose whatever titillating value it might have and just become rather dull. One interesting concept about the book is that we're all kind of told that women like romance and men like sex, and that is reflected in the books that we read and the movies that we watch. But with the exception of perhaps Lady Chatterley's Lover or a few books by Ken Follett, I don't think that I've ever read anything as explicit as this that was aimed at a male audience. A lot of the books I've read by male authors that have a romantic element will often gloss over this sort of thing in a few words, something perhaps along the lines of "they made love all afternoon," and really you don't get any more than that. You would have thought in a book that began life as vampire fan fiction and is basically the story of how Christian Grey tries to lure Anastasia, if you like, into doing something she doesn't really want to do, that element of the seduction would be more front and centre than it actually is. What actually occurs in the book takes the place of just kind of set pieces where Christian takes Anastasia to places that billionaires can go, such as private jets and private helicopter rides at twilight and things like that. The focus is much more on his physical attributes and the sex, and this isn't what we're led to believe women are looking for. So it's certainly an eye-opener and an interesting concept raised by the book. Now, without discussing this with more people, I can't be sure that it isn't a male-female thing or a purely personal thing, but certainly I found very little in this novel to be sexy. And I think that a lot of that comes down to the characters and the way they're portrayed. In the early stages of the book particularly, Anastasia Steele is described as being quite mousy, with her friend is much more beautiful, and she's described as the plain one, which of course we know isn't the case because everybody other than her tells her how beautiful she is, which is a little bit of a dull cliche really. We've seen this in every romantic movie since about 1990. But it isn't just that, she's also clumsy and ridiculously over-enamoured with Christian. Certainly until they begin their relationship, somewhere around the 100-page mark, she's actually rather irritating. With Christian, it's certainly in character and his desire for this bondage relationship for him to be aloof, to be unemotional and controlling, but he doesn't necessarily come across as all those things. Sometimes he just comes across as moody or petulant and sulky. And at the same time, he's described on more than one occasion as being a bit of a stalker. And I think that if you're a moody stalker, you're much more likely to end up in prison than you are in a young lady's bed. But I guess perhaps being a billionaire helps with that. Christian is obviously carrying some psychological damage, but E.L. James holds a lot of that back for the sequel. So you really just don't ever get inside his head. And that leaves, as a male reader, I mean, obviously I can't really relate to Anastasia Steele, but I'm really not relating to Christian Grey either. And it leaves the whole thing just feeling a little unemotional. Once Anastasia and Christian actually begin their relationship, the book does improve somewhat and starts to hold the interest a little more effectively. But it certainly would be hard to, well, unless you're recommending the sex scenes to somebody, it would certainly be hard to pick out a part where you would say that bit's particularly good or that bit's particularly interesting, because most of the book seems to take place inside Anastasia's mind and very little actually happens. Despite initially not caring for either character, as the book progressed I did start to get a little bit more interested in them and where they were going. So it did hold the interest more than I thought it would, so there's definitely some writing skill there. However, where that's lacking somewhat is certain parts of the book become highly repetitive. Now, I've already mentioned the sex scenes, but we're told repeatedly about the way Christian Grey's trousers hang off his hips, or the different shades of grey that his eyes take on. And if I had £1 for every time Anastasia flushed red, I would be about as rich as E.L. James is right now. I think in the hands of a more skillful writing and editing team, some of that repetition could have been taken out, the book would have been shorter and more streamlined and probably more effective for it. Despite all of that, I think I kind of enjoyed it. Certainly once the relationship begins, some of the exchanges, particularly via email that are reproduced in the book, some of the exchanges between Christian and Anastasia are quite pithy and entertaining, and I was interested to see how it turned out. It is unlikely to ever become a literary great, but it is a cultural great. Almost everybody's heard of it and knows something of what it's about. And I think that's reflected in that, as an experience shared, this book has a different life to if you've just read it on your own. Certainly reading it with somebody, I think you'd get more from it, whether that was just simply enjoying it for its merits, or laughing perhaps at some of the content, or any other reason really. Certainly I feel that if your partner is reading this book, you probably should get a copy of it yourself and read it with them.